The auctioneer's gavel fell like a death sentence, and with it, the last of Rosalie Brennan's sisters vanished into the arms of a stranger who'd bid her weight in silver dollars. Dust swirled through the makeshift auction platform erected in copper. Ridge's town square, catching the late afternoon sun like fool's gold. The crowd that had gathered with eager wallets and hungry eyes began to thin, their appetites satisfied by the morning's offerings. 5 daughters of the late Patrick Brennan had stood upon these weathered planks when the sun was high. Now as shadows stretched long across the Colorado Territory, only one remained. Rosalie pressed her back against the rough pine post, her calico dress, her only decent dress, clinging to her spine with perspiration that had nothing to do with the heat. The rope that bound her wrists behind the post chafed raw against her skin, but she'd long since stopped struggling. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when her family's debts hung over them like a thundercloud ready to burst. The morning had started with such hope. Her eldest sister Catherine had held her head high as she was claimed by a cattle baron from Denver, her dowry of beauty and breeding worth every penny of the $300 he'd paid. Sweet Margaret had wept pretty tears that only made her more desirable to the silver-haired banker who'd outbid 2 ranchers for her hand. Even wild-spirited Colleen had found herself a match with a young homesteader who'd looked at her with something approaching tenderness. But as the day wore on and the crowd grew rougher, the bidding had turned uglier. Poor little Bridget, barely 17 with cornsilk hair and frightened doe eyes, had been sold to a grizzled trapper who'd counted out his money in grimy bills that stank of beaver pelts and unwashed bodies. The man had leered at her with tobacco-stained teeth while she trembled like a leaf in a storm. Rosalie had watched it all with growing horror, her heart breaking a little more with each transaction. This wasn't how their father had imagined it when he'd borrowed against the ranch to expand his herd. Patrick Brennan had been a dreamer, a man who'd believed that good intentions and hard work could overcome any obstacle. He'd never imagined that a harsh winter and a cattle plague would leave his daughters as collateral for debts that stretched from here to Kansas City. Well, called out Tobias Grimm, the town's self-appointed auctioneer and her father's chief creditor. His voice carried the oily satisfaction of a man who'd already pocketed more than his due. Seems we got ourselves one last flower to auction off. Though I reckon this one's a mite too thorny for most decent men's taste. A ripple of laughter rolled through the remaining spectators, mostly drifters and cowboys with more liquor than sense in their bellies. The respectable folk had departed with their purchases, leaving behind the dregs of humanity to feast on the final course. Rosalie kept her chin high, her green eyes fixed on the distant mountains where freedom lived beyond the reach of grasping hands and legal documents. She'd inherited her father's stubborn streak along with his emerald eyes, and she'd be damned if she'd give these vultures the satisfaction of seeing her break. What am I bid for this here spirited filly? Grimm's voice cracked like a whip. She's got all her teeth, strong as an ox, and I'm told she can cook, clean, and birth babies like any good Christian woman ought to. Course, she's got a mouth on her that could strip paint off a barn, but a firm hand can cure that ailment quick enough. The crowd shifted restlessly, boots shuffling in the dust. A few men stepped forward, their eyes calculating as they took in her auburn hair and the curves her worn dress couldn't quite hide. But something in her gaze, something wild and untamed as a mountain cat, made them pause. Rosalie had spent her 22 years learning to survive in a world that wanted to break her spirit. She'd gentled wild horses with patience and steel, nursed sick cattle through the bitter cold, and stood toe-to-toe with rustlers who'd thought her an easy target. The fire in her belly had been forged in the same furnace that had claimed her mother's life, birthing her, and it burned now with the intensity of a prairie wildfire. $50, called out a voice from the back. Rosalie's blood turned to ice water. She knew that voice. Caleb Rollins, the meanest snake in 3 counties, with hands that left bruises and a reputation that made decent folk cross themselves and hurry their children indoors. 50? That's mighty generous, Caleb. Grimm's grin revealed teeth like broken fence posts. Any other takers? This here's prime breeding stock, gentlemen. Look at those hips. She could drop a dozen sons without breaking a sweat. The crude assessment sent heat rushing to Rosalie's cheeks, but she kept her expression stone cold. She'd learned early that showing weakness was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. You can almost smell the desperation in the air, thick as smoke from a grass fire. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods that lined the creek. 60. Offered another voice, Moses Hartwell, who'd buried 2 wives already and was hunting for a third. The man had the look of a weasel about him, with narrow eyes and a thin mustache that twitched when he was excited. Rosalie's stomach turned over like a sick horse. 75, Caleb countered, his voice carrying the promise of violence barely held in check. He pushed through the crowd, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow light itself. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles like a roadmap of violence, and his smile revealed gaps where teeth had been knocked out in countless brawls. The crowd fell silent again. $75 was more than most of these men saw in half a year. Rosalie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her fate settling around her shoulders like a burial shroud. She thought of her sisters scattered to the 4 winds, of the ranch that would now belong to strangers, of the grave where her parents lay beneath the cottonwoods. 75 once. Grim called out, his voice sing-song with triumph. 75. Twice. $500. The voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade through silk. Quiet, controlled, and absolutely certain. Every head turned toward the sound, and Rosalie's eyes snapped open at the edge of the crowd stood. A man she'd never seen before, tall and lean as a rifle barrel, with dark hair beneath a black hat and clothes that spoke of money without shouting about it. His face was hard-carved as granite, with eyes the color of winter storms. A thin scar ran from his left temple too, his jaw, white against sun-weathered skin. Who was this stranger, and what did he want with a woman who'd already sworn she'd rather die than be broken? The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses as he walked forward, his spurs chiming soft as church bells with each measured step. He moved with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with violence, his right hand resting easy near the pearl-handled Colt at his hip. "Did you say 500, stranger?" Grim's voice had gone up an octave, and Rosalie could see the greed gleaming in his piggy eyes like lamplight. $500 would clear the Brennan debts with money to spare, more than enough to satisfy even his rapacious appetite. "I did." The man's voice was low and rough, like whiskey aged in charred oak. "Cash money." A murmur ran through the crowd like wildfire. $500 was more than most of them would see in a lifetime. Caleb Rollins spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust and stalked away, his face black as a storm cloud. Moses Hartwell melted back into the crowd like morning mist, his weasel eyes darting nervously between the stranger and the nearest saloon. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," Grim breathed, his hands already twitching toward the money pouch at his belt. 500 it is. Going once, going twice. The stranger's eyes found Rosalie's across the crowd, and something passed between them, a spark of recognition, though she was certain she'd never seen him before in her life. His gaze held hers steady, and she saw something there that made her breath catch in her throat. Not hunger, like the others. Not calculation or cruelty, something else entirely. Something that looked almost like regret. "Soul." Grim's gavel crashed down like thunder. "The girl goes to the gentleman for $500 American." The stranger reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet, counting out bills with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to large transactions. Each crisp note fell into Grim's waiting palm like a nail in a coffin lid. The crowd watched in fascination as more money than they'd ever seen changed hands in broad daylight. "Pleasure doing business with you, mister." Grim's voice held a note of curiosity that bordered on greed. A man with that kind of ready cash might have other business opportunities to offer. "Blackwood," the stranger replied, his tone offering no further information. "Nathan Blackwood." The name meant nothing to Rosalie, but she caught the way several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping to the ground. A few even took subtle steps backward, as if the name carried some invisible weight that pressed against their chests. Nathan Blackwood approached the platform with measured steps, his boot heels marking time against the packed earth. Up close, Rosalie could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of too many hard years under an unforgiving sun. He was older than she'd first thought. Maybe 35, with the weathered look of a man who'd seen the elephant and lived to tell the tale. "Ma'am," he said quietly, tipping his hat with old-world courtesy that seemed strangely out of place in the rough frontier town. His voice carried the faint trace of an accent she couldn't quite place. Not quite Southern, not quite Eastern, but something that spoke of education and refinement. Grim fumbled with the rope that bound her wrists, his pudgy fingers made clumsy by excitement and whiskey. "There you go, Mr. Blackwood. She's all yours now, legal and proper. Got the papers right here if you need 'em." "That won't be necessary," Nathan said, his attention fixed on Rosalie as the ropes fell away. She rubbed her wrists, feeling the burn of restored circulation, and found herself looking up into eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. The question caught her off guard. "Not? Are you going to cause trouble? Or do you know what's expected of you?" Just a simple inquiry about her welfare that seemed to carry genuine concern. "No," she managed, her voice rougher than she'd intended. "I'm fine." He nodded once, then turned to address the crowd that had gathered to witness this strange transaction. "Show's over, boys. Time to move along." There was something in his tone, quiet authority backed by the promise of swift consequences, that sent the spectators scattering like tumbleweeds before a storm. Even Grimm seemed to sense the shift in the air, gathering his papers and money. With unseemly haste. "Well then," the auctioneer mumbled, "I reckon that concludes today's business. Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Blackwood. Miss Brennan, you mind yourself now." Within minutes, the town square had emptied except for the two of them. Nathan stood with his hands clasped behind his back, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. "I suppose you're expecting me to thank you," Rosalie said, lifting her chin with a defiance that felt hollow even to her own ears. "No," Nathan replied simply. "I'm not expecting anything." His answer deflated her anger like a punctured balloon. She'd been prepared for demands, for crude expectations, for the casual cruelty that men like Caleb Rollins wore like Sunday clothes. This quiet consideration was worse somehow. It left her with nowhere to direct the rage that had been sustaining her. "Then what do you want?" she asked, hating the way her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains that ringed the valley like sleeping giants. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of old sorrow. "I want to offer you a choice," he said. "Something nobody else was willing to do." "What kind of choice?" He turned back to her, and she saw something flicker in his storm-gray eyes, a vulnerability that he quickly shuttered behind walls of hard-won control. "Come with me willingly, and I'll give you work that pays fair wages, a roof over your head, food on your table, and the freedom to leave when you're ready. Or," he paused, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a small leather pouch, "take this money and disappear. There's enough here to get you to San Francisco, maybe even further if you're careful." Rosalie stared at the pouch, her mind reeling. "You'd just let me go?" "I'd prefer it, actually." The honest admission hit her like a physical blow. "Then why bid on me at all?" Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "Because I've seen what men like Rollins do to women who can't fight back. And because—" He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge unwelcome thoughts. "Because I made a promise to someone once. A promise I failed to keep." The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded, and it touched something deep in Rosalie's chest. She found herself taking a step closer, drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand. What promise? But Nathan had already turned away, his walls snapping back into place like a steel trap. What haunted past had driven this mysterious man to spend a fortune on a stranger's freedom? And why did his pain call to something broken inside her own heart? The leather pouch felt heavier than lead in Rosalie's hands, its weight seeming to anchor her to the dusty ground beneath her feet. Freedom. Real freedom, not the illusion of choice that had been dangled before her sisters like fool's gold. She could take this money and disappear into the vastness of the frontier, become someone new entirely. But something held her back. A stubborn curiosity that had always been her greatest weakness and her greatest strength. "I don't understand you," she said, her fingers tightening around the pouch. "Men don't spend $500 on charity. There's always a price." Nathan's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You're right about that. There's always a price." He turned to face her fully, and she caught a glimpse of something raw and wounded in his expression before he shuddered it away. "The question is whether you're willing to pay it." "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, he began walking toward the edge of town, where a fine black stallion waited patiently at the hitching post. The horse was magnificent, coal black with white markings on its legs like expensive stockings, its saddle and bridle crafted from leather that probably cost more than most folks' annual wages. "You coming or not?" Nathan called over his shoulder. Rosalie hesitated, her practical mind warring with her restless heart. The smart thing would be to take the money and run. She could catch the next stage west, maybe find work in one of the mining camps where questions weren't asked and pasts could be buried as deep as any silver vein. But something about Nathan Blackwood called to her like a moth to flame. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, not like a possession to be owned, but like a puzzle to be solved. Or maybe it was the pain she'd glimpsed behind his careful mask, a pain that echoed her own in ways she couldn't quite name, against her better judgment. She followed him. The stallion nickered softly as they approached, its intelligent eyes studying her with the same intensity as its master. Nathan stroked the animal's neck with surprising gentleness, whispering words she couldn't catch in what sounded like a foreign language. "Beautiful horse," Rosalie said, reaching out tentatively to touch the velvet muzzle. The stallion allowed the contact, his breath warm against her palm. "His name is Diablo," Nathan said. "Found him wild in the mountains 5 years ago, half dead from a wolf attack. Took 3 months to gain his trust." There was something in the way he said it that made her look at him sharply. "And now he'd die for me, and I'd do the same for him." Nathan's hand stilled on the horse's neck. Trust is a rare thing out here, precious as water in the desert. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Rosalie felt her pulse quicken, though whether from fear or something else entirely. She couldn't say. "Where are we going?" she asked as Nathan untied the reins. "My ranch. It's about an hour's ride north of here." He swung up into the saddle with fluid grace, then extended his hand to her. "Unless you've changed your mind about that stage to San Francisco." She stared at his outstretched hand, calloused and scarred from hard work and harder living. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, to take the money and disappear into the anonymity of the frontier. But something stronger held her back, a desperate need to understand the man who'd appeared like an answer to a prayer she'd never dared to voice. "I haven't changed my mind," she said, grasping his hand and allowing him to pull her up behind him. "But I want answers." "Fair enough." Nathan's voice was steady, but she felt the tension in his shoulders as she settled against his back. "But some answers come with a price of their own." They rode in silence through the gathering dusk, the stallion's hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The town of Copper Ridge fell away behind them, its lights beginning to twinkle in windows like fallen stars. The air grew cooler as they climbed into the foothills, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the high peaks. Rosalie had never been this close to a man before, not like this, with her arms wrapped around his waist and her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his coat. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, the controlled power in his frame, the way he moved with his horse as if they were one creature instead of two. "Tell me about the promise," she said suddenly, the words carried away by the wind almost. Before she'd spoken them, Nathan's back stiffened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the sound of hoofbeats. "I had a wife once," he said. "Her name was Isabella. She was like you in some ways. Strong, stubborn, beautiful as a sunrise and twice as fierce." Past tense. The words hit Rosalie like a physical blow, and she felt her heart constrict with unexpected sympathy. What happened to her? She was taken. Nathan's voice went flat, emotionless. "Raiders hit our ranch while I was away on business. By the time I got back." He stopped, his entire body going rigid. "I found her 3 days later. Too late. Always too late." The raw pain in his voice made Rosalie's chest ache. Without thinking, she tightened her arms around him, offering what comfort She could through the simple contact. She felt him shudder, just once, before his control reasserted itself. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his shoulder. "She made me promise, before we married, that I'd never let another woman suffer what she'd suffered before I found her." Nathan's voice was steady again, but she could feel the tremor in his hands on the reins. Isabella escaped from a brothel in Kansas City. She'd been sold there when she was 15, just like you were sold today. The pieces began to fall into place like dominoes, each revelation building on the last until the full picture emerged. "That's why you bid on me. That's why I bid on you," he confirmed. "I couldn't save her, but maybe I could save you." They crested a hill, and spread out below them was a valley that took Rosalie's breath away. A ranch house sat nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, its windows glowing warm yellow in the gathering darkness. Outbuildings dotted the landscape like sleeping giants, and she could make out the shapes of cattle grazing in the distance. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Isabella chose the spot," Nathan said simply. She said it looked like the valley in her dreams, the place where she'd always imagined she'd be safe. But as they rode down into the valley, Rosalie noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh wool tracks in the dirt, boot prints around the house, and in the corral, horses that didn't belong to any ranch hand. "Nathan," she said urgently, but he'd already seen what she'd seen. His hand dropped to his gun as riders emerged from the shadows around the house, their faces hidden by masks and their intentions written in the way they held their weapons. Who were these men waiting in the darkness? And what did they want with the mysterious widower who'd just brought home a woman worth killing for? Nathan's hand froze halfway to his Colt as a familiar voice cut through the mountain air like a rusty blade. "I wouldn't if I were you, Blackwood." From behind the barn stepped a figure that made Nathan's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Marshal Wade Garrison, tall, silver-haired, and wearing a badge that caught the last rays of sunlight like a promise of justice. But Rosalie could see something wrong in the way Nathan's entire body went rigid, feel it in the way his breathing turned shallow and controlled. "Been a long time, Nathan," Garrison called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman. "Mighty fine spread you got here. Shame about what happened to your wife, though. Heard tell it was quite the tragedy." The words hit Nathan like physical blows, and Rosalie felt him flinch against her. She could sense the barely contained violence radiating from him, the way a smart horse senses a coming storm. "What do you want, Garrison?" Nathan's voice was deadly quiet. "Oh, I think you know." The marshal stepped closer, and now Rosalie could see the other men emerging from the shadows, 6 of them, all armed, all watching Nathan with the patient hunger of wolves circling wounded prey. "Been tracking stolen cattle across 3 territories. Trail led right here to your valley. My cattle are branded legal and proper." "Funny thing about brands," Garrison mused, pulling a cheroot from his vest pocket and lighting it with deliberate slowness. "They can be changed, altered. A man with the right skills can make a Circle K look like a rocking bee without too much trouble." Nathan's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "And you're saying I'm that man?" "I'm saying a lot of things don't add up where you're concerned, Blackwood. A man appears out of nowhere 5 years ago with enough money to buy prime ranch land. Keeps to himself, doesn't socialize much. And now cattle with suspicious brands start showing up on his property." Garrison took a long draw on his cheroot, the tip glowing red in the gathering darkness. "Makes a man wonder what other secrets you might be hiding." Rosalie's mind raced as she listened to the exchange. There was history here, bad blood that ran deeper than accusations of cattle rustling. She could feel it in the way Nathan's muscles coiled like a spring under pressure, see it in the calculated cruelty of Garrison's smile. "Get down," Nathan murmured to her, his voice so low only she could hear. "When I give the word, run for the house and don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," she whispered back, surprising herself with the fierceness of her conviction. "Rosalie, what's that you got there, Nathan?" Garrison interrupted, his pale eyes fixing on her with predatory interest. "New acquisition? Heard tell there was quite the auction in town today. 5 sisters, wasn't it? Wonder what became of the others." The casual mention of her family made Rosalie's blood boil, but Nathan's warning hand on her leg kept her silent. She could feel the danger crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. "The woman's none of your concern," Nathan said. "Oh, but she is." Garrison flicked ash from his cheroot, the gesture somehow obscene. See, there's been reports of women going missing along the frontier. Young women, pretty women, sold into slavery. Some say, terrible business. His smile was razor sharp. Of course, a man with your particular talents would know all about that kind of trade, wouldn't you? The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and Rosalie felt Nathan's entire body go deadly still. When he spoke, his voice carried the promise of violence barely held in check. You're walking on dangerous ground, Marshal. Am I? Garrison gestured to his men, who began to spread out in a loose circle around them. See, I got a warrant here for your arrest. Cattle rustling, trafficking in stolen goods, and suspicion of involvement in the disappearance of several young women across Colorado territory. That's a lie, Rosalie said before she could stop herself, the words bursting out of her like water. Through a cracked dam. He saved me, gave me a choice when no one else would. Garrison's attention swung to her like a hawk spotting a mouse. Did he now? And what choice was that, miss? He offered me freedom, money to leave if I wanted. How generous. The marshal's tone dripped with false sympathy. Of course, that's exactly what a smart man would do. Gain your trust, make you grateful. Amazing how willing a woman can be when she thinks she's been rescued instead of captured. The words hit Rosalie like a slap, planting seeds of doubt that she desperately wanted to reject. But even as her heart rebelled against the suggestion, her mind began cataloging details. Nathan's wealth, his isolation, the way people in town had reacted to his name. What did she really know about him beyond a tragic story and gentle hands? Don't listen to him, Nathan said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. He's poison, Rosalie. Everything he touches turns to ash. Touching words, Garrison said. But words don't change facts. And the fact is, Nathan Blackwood, you're coming with me. Dead or alive, makes no difference to me. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 6 guns against 1, with Rosalie caught in the middle like a leaf in a whirlwind. The mountain air grew thick with tension, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. You can almost taste the violence hanging in the air, metallic and sharp as fresh blood. There's another option, Nathan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. One you might find more profitable than a dead fugitive. Garrison raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. The woman for my freedom. She's worth more alive than I am dead. The words hit Rosalie like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. After everything, the rescue, the gentle words, the story of his dead wife. Was she nothing more than a bargaining chip after all? Nathan, she breathed. But he didn't look at her. Interesting proposition, Garrison mused. But why should I settle for one when I can have both? That's when Nathan smiled, and Rosalie saw something in his expression that made her blood sing. With sudden hope. It wasn't the smile of a defeated man making a desperate bargain. It was the smile of a predator who'd just laid the perfect trap. Because, Nathan said quietly, his hand moving in a motion too quick to follow. You forgot about Diablo. The stallion reared with a scream that split the night air like a war cry, his iron-shod hooves striking out at the nearest gunman. In the chaos that followed, Nathan rolled from the saddle, his Colt clearing leather with the smooth precision of a man who'd danced this dance before. But as gunfire erupted around them and men began to fall, Rosalie realized that the real battle wasn't for their lives. It was for the truth about who Nathan Blackwood really was. Gunfire erupted like thunder across the valley, muzzle flashes lighting the gathering darkness in stark, violent bursts. Nathan moved with deadly precision, his Colt barking twice in rapid succession as 2 of Garrison's men crumpled to the ground. Diablo wheeled and struck again, his hooves crushing the rifle of a 3rd gunman who screamed and rolled away, clutching a shattered arm. Rosalie threw herself behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead, her heart hammering against her ribs. Like a caged bird. Through the chaos, she watched Nathan dance between shadows and gunfire with the fluid grace of a man who'd been born to violence. Every movement was calculated, efficient, beautiful in its deadly perfection. Take cover in the house, Nathan shouted over the din, but Rosalie shook her head, as she'd spent too many years learning to survive to cower now. Spotting a rifle dropped by one of the fallen men, she lunged for it, her fingers closing around the familiar weight of good steel and seasoned with Garrison's voice cut through the battle like a rusty saw. You always were too clever for your own good, Blackwood, but it won't save you this time. The marshal had taken position behind the barn, his remaining men spread out in a deadly crossfire. Nathan was pinned down behind a feed wagon, his ammunition running low, when Rosalie saw her chance. She'd grown up hunting deer in the Colorado mountains, and at this range, a man was a much larger target than a white-tailed buck. The rifle kicked against her shoulder as she squeezed the trigger, and Garrison's hat went flying into the darkness. Son of a, the marshal spun toward her, his own weapon rising, when Nathan's voice rang out across the valley. That's enough. Wait. The authority in his tone was unmistakable, cutting through the gunfire like a blade through silk. Even Garrison hesitated, his finger frozen on the trigger. Nathan stepped into the open, his hands raised but his eyes blazing with cold fire. It's over. Your men are down, and you're outnumbered. Garrison laughed, but there was desperation in the sound now. Outnumbered? By you and a woman with a rifle? I don't think so. Not just us, Nathan said quietly. Them. From the darkness. Beyond the barn came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, dozens of them, growing louder by the second. Torches appeared on the horizon like fallen stars, moving fast toward the ranch. You see, Wade, Nathan continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. You made one crucial mistake. You assumed I was working alone. The riders swept into the valley like avenging angels, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. At their head rode a man Rosalie recognized, Deputy Marshal James Morrison from the territorial capital, his badge gleaming in the torchlight. Marshal Garrison, Morrison called out, his voice sharp with authority. By order of the territorial governor, you're under arrest for corruption, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. Garrison's face went white as bleached bone. That's impossible. I'm a federal marshal, not anymore. Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. Seems your little cattle rustling operation finally caught up with you. Amazing how willing men become to talk when they're facing the gallows. The pieces fell into place in Rosalie's mind like dominoes. The accusations against Nathan, the personal vendetta, the convenient warrant, all of it orchestrated by a corrupt lawman trying to eliminate the one man who could expose his crimes. Nathan Blackwood has been working undercover for the territorial government for 2 years, Morrison continued, gathering evidence against your operation, documenting every stolen head of cattle, every bribe, every woman you sold into slavery. Rosalie's breath caught in her throat. Undercover. Everything made sense now. The money, the isolation, the way people reacted to his name. He wasn't a criminal. He was a lawman, just like she'd suspected when she'd seen that badge in town. No, Garrison snarled, his composure finally cracking. I won't let you destroy everything I've built. The corrupt marshal raised his gun toward Nathan, but Rosalie was faster. The rifle bucked in her hands, and Garrison stumbled backward, his weapon spinning away into the darkness. He clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers, his face twisted with rage and defeat. It's over, Wade, Nathan said quietly. Finally over. As Morrison's men secured the scene and tended to the wounded, Nathan walked slowly toward Rosalie. She set down the rifle with trembling hands, her mind still reeling from the revelations. You're a lawman, she said, not quite making it a question. Deputy. Territorial marshal, yes. Nathan stopped just out of arm's reach, his storm gray eyes searching her face. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before. Too many lives depended on maintaining my cover. The story about Isabella, was that true? Pain flickered across his features like lightning. Every word. She was murdered by Garrison's men because she'd recognized one of them from the brothel where she'd been held. They killed her to keep her quiet. Rosalie felt tears prick her eyes at the raw anguish in his voice. I'm sorry. I've spent 2 years hunting the men responsible. Tonight was supposed to be the end of it. Nathan's gaze dropped to the ground. I never meant for you to get caught in the middle. But I did get caught, Rosalie said softly. And you saved me, just like you promised Isabella you would. When Nathan looked up, she saw hope flickering in his eyes like the first green shoots of spring. Does that mean, would you consider staying? I know it's asking a lot, after everything. Rosalie silenced him by stepping forward and placing her hand against his cheek. The stubble was rough beneath her palm, and she could feel the tremor that ran through him at her touch. "You gave me a choice once," she said. "Freedom or a new life." "I'm choosing the new life, Nathan Blackwood. With you, if you'll have me." His arms came around her then, pulling her against his chest with a desperation that spoke of too many lonely nights and too much grief carried alone. She could feel his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong as the mountains that surrounded their valley. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "God help me, I never meant to, but I do." "I love you too," she whispered back, and felt the last of the walls around her heart crumble like autumn leaves. They were married 3 months later, on a bright October morning when the aspens had turned to gold and the air sparkled with the promise of snow. Rosalie wore Isabella's wedding dress, a gesture Nathan had suggested and she'd accepted, understanding that some ghosts needed to be honored rather than forgotten. The valley bloomed under their care, just as Isabella had dreamed it would. Cattle grazed in green pastures, horses ran free in the corral, and laughter once again echoed from the ranch house windows. In the spring, Rosalie planted a garden behind the house, filling it with roses that bloomed wild and sweet in the mountain air, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, she thought she could almost hear Isabella's voice on the breeze, thanking her for keeping Nathan's heart safe until love could find him again. The end came not with gunfire, but with the gentle sound of wedding bells and the promise of roses blooming eternal in a valley where love had conquered all. If this tale of love conquering the wildest frontier touched your heart, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories of romance and adventure from the untamed West. Share in the comments where you're watching from today. We love hearing from fellow lovers of frontier romance around the world.